Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another top 10 list. Well, surprise! I'm back again to talk more about this legendary French house duo. Having just come off the heels of a review of their latest album called Hyperdrama, I randomly felt like giving people a bonus video to add on to it. I might have needed a break both from writing a very big Some Stuff I Missed roundup coming up soon, as well as from the other insane things that have gone on recently in the music world right now. Jesus Christ, Kendrick. So, my Hyperdrama review, spoilers, may have been mostly lukewarm and gone more in depth on the aspects of this band that have always frustrated me, but today I'm flipping the script and talking about the aspects of this band that I actually like the most and that I feel most live up to the insane amount of hype they've always had. I've never tried to do this video in previous years, despite knowing it could get me a lot of views, because I never felt like I had enough songs to actually choose from. This band only has 4 studio albums, and I really only properly love their first one, while all the others are much more like mixed bags at best. Yeah, I know, I'm not a real fan and all that. But at least with the release of that 4th album, that gave me enough to choose from to fill out a usual-sized list of honorable mentions that felt right to me. At the end of the day, it is worth noting that everything in this video is obviously just my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with it. These are ranked purely based on what I happen to personally enjoy the most, and your list could theoretically consist entirely of tracks that are not on my top 10 list at all. What you like the most in this band could be completely different from what I like the most in their stuff. When I mentioned in the Hyperdrama video that Ohio from AVD is my personal least favorite track this band has ever put out, I immediately got several very incensed comments from people who think that track is like the greatest thing that's ever been made or something. Just goes to show how this is all subjective at the end of the day. And if your favorite track isn't here, then obviously there's no need to take it personally or anything. Feel free to post your own list in the comments if you feel so inclined. I seriously doubt the tracks I actually have included are going to be all that controversial, but hey, I could be wrong. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's finally get into it. This is the top 10 best Justice songs. Number 10, Valentine from Cross. Nowadays, with the direction this band has been going lately, you won't find any shortage of comparatively more chill and melodic tracks in their repertoire, but Cross was a very loud and abrasive album, and a track like this definitely stood out a lot more in their catalog at the time. And even as we've gotten lots more toned-down tracks from them, that hasn't taken away from the effect this track has with its bright, super trampish Rhodes electric pianos going up against all these spacious synth melodies, going through all these classical-inspired cadences. Do-do, do-do, do-do. By the standards of this album, it's toned down, but it's still just as big and heavy and dramatic to still perfectly fit well with that project's tone. Able to effectively hit on an emotional note that feels like it has proper stakes and deliver some punch to it that some of their newest tracks, like, say, One Night All Night, for instance, don't have to the same extent. Maybe you prefer the Dear Allens or Brian Visions in their catalog, but at least for me, this probably stands as my favorite of their somewhat more chill, progressive synth-leaning material. So I had to give it a shout. But while we're on the topic of some of my favorite Cross deep cuts... Number 9. New Jack from Cross. Right, next we got one of this album's most strikingly lighthearted and playful moments in delivering exactly the kind of sound you think of when we're talking about French house. Taking a pretty straightforward sample from an old 80s funk track by the Brothers Johnson called You Make Me Wanna Wiggle, glitching it up into oblivion with all these crazy intense bass lines and harder hitting drums, even adding in all these blippy synth melodies being chopped up out of a stock Apple computer sound effect of all things that comes like pre-packaged with GarageBand. I didn't even realize that was where it came from until I just looked it up, but yeah, that's definitely one of the most creative flips of a stock sound effect like that I've heard. Nice to run into an Apple loop like that and think that's actually cool instead of amateurish and dated as hell. With how more often than not Justice take themselves a lot more seriously and always go out of their way to sound cool and impressive, it's nice to get a track like this which is just fun in a more low stakes kind of way, but still bangs just as hard as anything else they've made in this era. Number 8. Civilization from Audio Video Disco. You know, in one breath, I seem to recall this track not being received that well upon its release, and I'm not going to pretend like I don't at least see why. When you compare the production from this track with the stuff from Cross, it is a clear step down, a lot hollower sounding with a lot of buzzing synths that people could find more annoying, and that whole slower bit in the intro is pretty unpleasant too. With that said, if there's any track from the AVD era that is most likely to pop into my head when I think about that album in passing, it's this one. That chorus is one of the catchiest hooks they've ever come up with. The track still maintains or even specifically focuses on some of that rock star swagger that they had on their first album, still makes them feel like the musical force to be reckoned with that they are. And maybe most impressive of all, they brought in Ali Love, a singer I know best for being on the Chemical Brothers' worst track by miles, Do It Again, and presented his otherwise grating voice in a way that actually sounds credibly badass. For all of that, I absolutely have to give Civilization props. Also, having been introduced to it as a teenager through that one CS188 video way back in the day might have helped this track cement itself in my mind that much more. Probably didn't hurt in any case. Number 7. Genesis from Cross. Alright, back to Cross. Yes, I know a lot of this top 10 is just from that album, half of it to be exact, but I mean, is anyone going to deny an intro as massive and iconic as this one? There's no better way to introduce someone to this band and immediately demonstrate how they got to the level of success they did than with a track as huge and imposing as Genesis. Hitting you with Titanic, Ten Commandments style horn samples that really nailed down that biblical imagery, no pun intended, that they've always based themselves around. Switching into this brutal, growling, distorted bass and heavily visceral beatwork, various glitches and synths around the edges, some funk guitar plucking, and an outro of big dramatic piano chords, all of it adding up to this massively impressive mix that lets you know these guys mean business. And if a track like this wasn't enough to convince you of how much they meant business, it goes hand in hand with his next pick as well. Number 6. Phantom and Phantom Part 2 from Cross. Genesis may have been the perfect hype-inducing introduction to the band, but Phantom is that album's big centerpiece. I guess your mileage may vary on whether it's fair to count both Phantom and Phantom Part 2 as the same track, taking up the same space on the list. The two tracks are pretty distinct, with the first part focusing on bassier, more distorted and edgier wubbing synths and samples and hyper-aggressive glitching noises, and the second part bringing in a 70s disco string section to really change things up. When presented in their live albums, they're never put back-to-back with each other, but as far as I'm concerned, in the original album, both tracks need each other to work the best, and very easily feel like two parts of the same whole. They segue perfectly into each other, and part 2 basically creates a new tune out of the exact same ingredients, twisting all these sounds into new, manners. Whether or not it's fair to say, given how much their sound has evolved over the years, both of these tracks as well as Genesis are probably the best representation of the kind of sound I think of when I think of Justice in passing. Just aggressive electro, glitches, noise, disco and funk sampling. Absolutely going the fuck off. It's a classic. We all know this. Though if you were getting tired of me bigging up Cross, not to worry, that's the last one I got on the list proper, outside of the obvious one you're probably thinking of. And as for the rest... Number 5. Safe and Sound from Woman. Woman is an album I've come to have pretty mixed feelings on in retrospect, but man, the way they initially tried to sell us on it, with this as the lead single, still leaves such a big impact to this day. A switch over into straight retro disco with none of the more abrasive touches that their previous work always had. Super slick slap bass, extravagant string sections and psychedelic synth washes, a full chorus singing the hook. The whole mix sounds incredible. The core tune is fantastic and never dips into full-on cheesiness as other parts of this album can. A detractor could say that this track falls too much in the shadow of a certain other more recognizable earlier hit of theirs, which I will get to. Although the tune on this one is more than strong enough to stand completely on its own merits, and for the comparison to not even come to mind until I clicked the Wikipedia article and saw that other track mentioned. I don't really know what else to say about it. As much as I love Cross, I feel like I've come back to this track out of context along with one other from this album, which I'll also get to, even more frequently than sitting down with that album. It just makes for such an instant little dopamine rush, and I've gotten a lot more replay value out of it than I would have expected when it first dropped. Number 4. Planisphere, non-album single, also bonus track on Audio Video Disco. Alright, if anyone was objecting to me counting Phantom and Phantom Part 2 as the same track on this list, me setting aside a spot for this behemoth might be even more contentious for those people. Originally, it wasn't even one track. It was first released in 2008 as a 4-track EP, acting as their soundtrack to the Dior Homme runway fashion show, and then later tacked on to the end of digital releases of Audio Video Disco as a bonus track. I actually had a commenter actively arguing with me about that track and trying to tell me that I was completely incorrect to associate it with the latter album in the first place. And while I can't deny it may be out of place if you include it on that album, I can't agree that the inclusion of this 17-minute opus that continues some of the sounds on Cross and makes them even bigger and more epic than ever before, blasting through more glitchy and aggressive electro house, dramatic classical piano, hip-hop sampling, 80s synthwave, and a gigantic prog rock climax at the end with all these crazy guitar solos, does anything but benefit Audio Video Disco in the long run. I mean, that was already a very all-over-the-place album in more ways than one, and tacking this on at the end just, for me, raises the album's average quality that much more. Also, it may be a 4-part suite, but they all have the exact same tune and clearly come together as the same piece. I think it makes perfect sense to just be counting it as a single track. I don't know, however you want to count it, hopefully we can agree that this is another one of the band's crowning achievements and one of the coolest things they've released. Needs to be heard regardless. Number 3. DANCE from Cross. Yeah, you knew this was coming. It's their big signature hit. It's the One Justice song that everyone's most likely to know in passing. Also the one that first introduced me to them in the first place, having picked it up from an iTunes Essentials playlist in high school. Although I actually completely forgot that was how I first came across them until I rewatched my old Cross and AVD review while working on the Hyperdrama video. This just feels like the kind of song that's existed forever and I've known my whole life. One that kind of transcends this album or this band's whole identity, like a playground nursery rhyme that's been passed down over so many generations that nobody remembers who originally came up with it. Which might be odd to say about a mildly fuzzed out French house disco cut like this that isn't too difficult to pin down to a specific movement in time, and sounds almost ready-made to fit in jeans commercials or something. You just don't hear tracks that sound like this being made in this day and age, and especially not with what sounds like a full chorus of kids singing on it. It's the kind of thing with the potential to, like, age really poorly and feel really tacky 17 years later, but all of it just works. That tune and hook is just absolutely eternal. The production is perfect for what it's going for, and I mean, yeah, this track is all but guaranteed to outlive them and every single one of us. But as obvious a pick as that is, there is a pair of tracks which get a lot more of a rush out of me on a personal level. Number 2. Audio Video Disco from Audio Video Disco. I'll say this, if you talked to me back in 2018 when I reviewed this album, I don't know if I would have believed this track would end up in this particular spot on the list. I knew I really liked the track, but certainly not to the point of making it all the way to number 2. Thing about this track, just this album so far haven't tended to have the most impactful of endings for me. That actually includes Cross. 1 Minute to Midnight is a good track, but it will not be appearing on this video. But AVD is obviously the big exception. After an album that shoots around all these wildly, tonally different classic rock pastiches, they make sure to go out with their most energetic and propulsive cut yet, with the fastest beats and the rapid pianos and guitars, and just letting it build and culminating in the single hardest drop on the whole album. With one of their absolute best hooks as well. I've had this track stuck in my head for entire days at a time without it wearing out on me. It's just so much pure contained triumph and excitement and sincere, earnest euphoria that you're left at the end like you've reached the peak and can't go any higher. It's like perfectly designed to be a closer to any live set they might have and be the big climactic barn burner to finish everything off. And my feelings on how this track ended up getting so high go hand in hand with what I picked for the number 1 spot, which might give away what I have there, but we're not quite ready to get to that. Before I get into my number 1 pick, here's a bunch of honorable mentions. On and On from Audio Video Disco. Neverender from Hyperdrama. Alakazam from Woman. Canon from Audio Video Disco. Incognito from Hyperdrama. Stop from Woman. Force Majeure from Gaspar Roger's Escapades. New Lands from Audio Video Disco. Generator from Hyperdrama. Stress from Cross. Moonlight Rendezvous from Hyperdrama. Rocambole from Gaspar Roger's Escapades. And yeah, that's going to be enough of that. By the way, if you think Gaspar Roger's solo tracks shouldn't be counting towards this list, you can replace those 2 picks with Dear Allen and Afterimage from Hyperdrama. I think I like those on a roughly equal level, but wanted to give the list a bit more visual variety. Anyway, that leaves my last pick, so let's get into that. Number 1. Chorus from Woman. I don't know how unconventional a take it is to put this track at the very top. I know it's not necessarily one of the most popular tracks from this album. What I do know is that I did not have to think hard about placing it here. This has been, definitively my favorite Justice track for several years now. Audio Video Disco is a track that feels like you've reached the peak and, basking in the glory of it. But this track feels like watching a rocket ship take off and leave the solar system. Listening to it on its own feels like there's no limit to how high you can possibly go, and you're just being propelled forward with such force that nothing can possibly stop you or get in your way. The beats and rhythmic bursts of noise are some of the most intense, heavy, and energetic I've ever heard from the band. The way they go up against the full choirs and eventual piano outro at the end really intensifies that feeling of going up into space and making the track feel like the biggest and most expansive mix they have in their repertoire. And the kick-ass guitar solo in the middle is just the cherry on top of all of it. I think you can guess what my favorite part of Woman Worldwide was. Matching this track up with Audio Video Disco was absolutely inspired. They complement each other so well, like they could be a part 1 and part 2 of the same track. And hearing it in that context, I think was the final key to cementing them as my favorite 2 tracks this band's ever made. AVD is a better ending and needs to come second if they're played back to back. But Chorus is without question the Justice track I've played most frequently out of context, and it's not particularly close at this point. As such, I knew there was no other viable option but to mark it as my number 1 favorite track of theirs overall. And yeah, that's the list. That's my top 10 favorite Justice tracks. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.